Welcome back to D1 Extra. I'm Kristen Eargle. As Stanford conducts their search for the next athletic director, we bring in John Wilner, sports reporter for San Jose and Mercury News. Thanks for being on today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, a significant transition period for Stanford as we're all watching. How do you assess their current marketplace positioning right now for Stanford athletics?
Well, it was a interesting transition period for Stanford even before Bernard Muir resigned in February, right? I mean, the ACC move, all of the secular trends in college athletics have created a fascinating dynamic for Stanford and for Cal, across the Bay. Both schools, a lot of parallels. And then you add in that Stanford has a new president, Jonathan Levin, who took over last summer. And then you add in Andrew Luck factor. He was hired as football GM in November. And then Bernard Muir steps down in February. And it is unlike any period the athletic department has experienced, in many, many years, if not ever. And from a positioning standpoint, it doesn't look good, right? The big picture stuff doesn't look great for them financially, competitively in the ACC, transfer portal, NIL, all those things, revenue sharing. But I look at it like if this job, this opening, it's almost like you're taking over a football program that is 1-11, right? And there's almost no place to go but up. I think it is kind of like Stanford recruiting itself, right? There's an appeal to a certain segment of the candidate pool. And for that segment, there's an incredible amount of appeal. For many others, probably not interested. But it's a great job for some and probably not a good job at all for many. And the question is whether they can kind of figure out who those some are, really. But I think place has got a ton of potential if it's managed properly, not only within athletics, but also the top of campus, which is a huge question.
You outlined a few things already, but a couple of things that you would say, these are the biggest challenges right now for the AD come in. What would that be?
Number one, number two, and number three is you got to fix football, right? You have to work with Luck on that. They have Frank Reich as an interim for the upcoming season. You've got to figure out within that space, how is Stanford going to deal with the transfer portal? And it's one thing to say you're getting transfers if they're from Princeton and Yale. I'm waiting to see the transfers from Auburn and Texas A&M, that kind of thing. So exactly what kind of flexibility do you have with the transfer portal for undergrads from the football conferences? To what extent are you all in with NIL? The true NIL that's coming, presumably once House is approved, but also what are you doing with revenue sharing? They haven't announced exactly what they're going to do for football as part of that $20.5 million. My presumption is they will be close to what the top of the ACC is, but there's pressures at Stanford that don't exist at other places for funding Olympic sports, for instance. Transfer portal, NIL, revenue sharing, figuring out football. That's really it, but that's a lot. Those are the big ones, and they've got to check the boxes for all of them.
I want to come back to what you said with Olympic sports, but right now, what would you say are some of those essential qualities that they must prioritize in the next AD?
I think that number one is probably you're going to have to be able to work with Andrew Luck because he is the football GM. He has a direct line to Jonathan Levin, the president, who hired him. He has full authority right now over the football program, right? He fired Troy Taylor. He hired Frank Reich. First of all, I'm sure Luck does not want to be the AD, but I also think he's smart enough to understand that he needs help and Stanford would benefit from him getting help. And I don't think Luck, I do think, I should say, he's perfectly willing to work with a new AD and even potentially report to the AD, but they've got to get that piece figured out and make that clear to the candidates, because nobody worth a dime is going to come in to take the Stanford AD job if you don't have any say over football, right? So that's a big piece. And I think you've got to be collaborative because there are so many different voices from the Olympic sports. The faculty obviously has a huge say in things, and you got to be able to work with President Jonathan Levin. It's just whether they should hire someone who has either been a Stanford student or Stanford athlete or Stanford employee. To me, that's probably the first question to answer. Do they have to hire from within the family, or do they feel like they can go outside the family and make it work? They hired multiple men's basketball coaches who had not worked or played for Stanford. It didn't work with either of them. So I think you can make a good case that it needs to be somebody who's got strong Stanford ties.
And how would you balance the football with the Olympic side of things, which is a hallmark of
Yeah, it is. It is. And if I'm being fully candid, I would say too bad Olympic sports. Football has got to be the priority right now, because if you are behind in football for the next 5 years, the long-term consequences are going to be incredibly damaging. Stanford's got 36 sports. One of them matters more than the other 35 combined. That's just the truth. And that's the reason Stanford is in this position in the first place, is it hasn't given enough priority to football, not enough resources to football over the years. And the voices for the other sports are, in some cases, legendary, incredibly influential within the Stanford community. But football has got to be the most, the priority here. And if that means that sport X doesn't get as much funding as it wants, too bad. To me, that's where they are at this point. And they're at this point because of not prioritizing football for many years.
Without talking specific names in the mix, let's talk leadership style. What leadership and management style do you think would thrive there?
You certainly have to be smart. You certainly have got to be collaborative. I think you certainly have got to embrace the broader Stanford mission, which I think that can be done while you're prioritizing football, right? Those are not exclusionary components to the whole puzzle, but you've got to have football acumen. And I think they really need someone who understands the landscape of college sports and where it's going. They can't get caught behind. Look, Stanford was caught off guard by the demise of the Pac-12. Their leadership didn't know what was going on, and they should have. Same thing happened to Cal, and the schools are paying for it. Frankly, they need to have somebody who can make that phone call, can back channel to contacts across the industry and see what's coming around the corner and position Stanford strategically on the field and off to be ready for the 2030s. So to me, those characteristics are almost more important than what is your management style on a day-to-day basis when you're dealing with golf and softball and some Nobel Prize winner and a trustee who's running a hedge fund. I mean, that all goes into it. But if you don't see where things are going, then the damage is going to be significant.
What pipelines would you tap into? I mean, how would they remain competitive in the ACC, especially thinking about if House gets finalized and all the things we previously mentioned?
Well, and in addition to those things, let's not forget the Stanford deal in the ACC. Stanford and Cal are both 30% revenue shares. And the timing of that is significant because it's for 7 years, which means they're at 30% revenue shares. And that's my understanding is that is not only for the ACC's Tier 1 rights, it's also for the ACC network all combined. Then you throw in the performance fund, the brand funds that the ACC is implementing, and I'm not sure how that's going to impact Cal and Stanford's revenue slices. But you put it all together, and it's going to last beyond the point of this so-called audition period, right?
Mm.
They're not going to get full revenue shares until after the ACC exit penalties have dropped in 2030. So that the conference could be completely different. It could be without Florida State and North Carolina and Clemson by the time Stanford and Cal actually get to full revenue. So it's a very complicated era for the two schools. But the thing is, for Stanford, it is all willpower. They got so much money that they could do whatever they want. They could be BYU. They could be like Texas Tech. They could be like Oregon. Whatever they want in this era of where, money matters externally, they've got it all. The university could fund the football program and all the other sports to the extent that whatever extent it desires. I mean, athletics is like a rounding error on the university's budget, but it's a willpower issue. Now, I think my understanding is that Jonathan Levin does care about football and recognizes its significance not only for the athletic department's budget, but for, engaging the Stanford community. And you don't have to look any further than like 12, 13 years ago, when they were really good under Harbaugh and Luck, applications for admission soared, donations were skyrocketing. They had these incredible alumni events at the Rose Bowl. Levin understands, I think, the impact that successful football can play across the university community. And, that dovetails with this search in that the athletic director who set that whole thing up was Bob Bowlesby, and his son Kyle is kind of run point for Elevate on the search. So that's a good pipeline of institutional knowledge for Stanford to tap, because Bob Bowlesby figured it out, and he had a willing president at the time, John Hennessy. Stanford was kind of rock bottom in 2005, 2006. The alumni were upset, and they were willing to do what it took to make the changes to win. Now, what it takes now is a lot different. Back then, it was internal changes. Now it's responding to external changes, but it's still the same basic issue. They're kind of rock bottom. And if they're willing to make the necessary changes, they could thrive. And if they're not, they're going to continue to scuttle.
What are you thinking in terms of a timeline?
I think that they will have someone in place in time for, Stanford's fiscal year is, it's either August 1st or August 31st. I can't remember at this point, but it's not July 1st. I think they'll have someone in place, by the end of July, early August is my guess. When they hired Bernard Muir, I want to say he took over in August. So that's my guess. It took them a month, and this is very Stanford. It took them a month to name an interim AD after Bernard Muir stepped down, right? Alden Mitchell was appointed a few weeks ago at the same time that they picked Elevate and named a search committee. Most other places, if your AD stepping down, you got an interim ready that day. Stanford took a month, which is understandable. Jonathan Levin's got a lot going on right now, and he's dealing with potential for billions in federal funding cuts. So there's a lot of issues for the campus over and above athletics, but it does tell you kind of where things stand, that it took him a month to appoint an interim.
If we could fast forward and go 5 years looking into the future, where do you think a great leader could take Stanford?
To the Big Ten, if I'm being honest, or to the Super League, or to the top tier of whatever college football is going to look like. I mean, I happen to believe that at that point in the 2030s, the Olympic sports are going to have to kind of reform along regional lines. I don't think this situation is sustainable for Stanford and Cal Olympic sports, or for USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington Olympic sports, right? So if we kind of figure that there's going to be a restructuring around regional lines there, and you're just focusing on football, I think that, the right AD with the right support from the university community and the right support from from the president's office could have Stanford positioned to be in whatever comes next, whether it's a 70-team Super League or a 32-team Super League or expansion by the Big Ten. Or if the ACC is thriving, Stanford could be at the top of the ACC, just like it was at the top of the Pac-12, Pac-10, Pac-12, 15 years ago. So it can be at the top. Stanford has incredible amount of potential, even in this environment with all the external challenges. If the willpower's there and if the strategy is there, Stanford could be, at the top. There's no doubt about that.
John, final question for you. If you could offer one piece of advice to the search committee as they evaluate candidates, what would it be and why?
I've already published my advice, which is that Stanford should kind of thank the search committee for its efforts, and then put a few people in a room, including Levin and Luck, and figure out who the AD is going to be. I think the search committee, to me, is the structure of it is not necessarily set up properly for football. It works politically for the university, but I mean, ultimately, is it the right mix of people to decide who's going to be best for Stanford football? And again, I'm taking a very narrow look at their search, but I think football has got to be the priority by an order of magnitude. So my advice would be, focus on that. And, if the person who gets hired isn't great for the Olympic sports, that's kind of the price you got to pay right now, because I think that the damage for Stanford athletics long term by getting this wrong is going to be immense. And getting it wrong means hiring someone who doesn't prioritize football in a manner that is going to, contradict what the university's athletic mission has been for a long time. But hey, it's a different world.
John, thank you so much for your time and insight. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.